Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. Today our guest is the author, critic, and journalist Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and a visiting professor of liberal studies at the New School in New York City. He is here to discuss his latest book, Hitch 22, a memoir. This is a two-part interview. In the first part, we'll be dealing with the more personal aspects of the memoir, and in the second part, the more political aspects, though of course there's bound to be overlap between personal and political. Christopher Hitchens, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thanks for having me.
I say Christopher.
Yes, please.
Because I know that you prefer to be called Christopher and not Chris, and you mention in your memoir the fact that early in your career at Oxford, the Marxists with whom you were involved called you Chris, and the tutors and the more elite faculty at Oxford called you Christopher. And I wonder if your preference doesn't suggest an underlying political loyalty from the very beginning.
The loyalty, alas, is less complicated than that. It was to my mother and to her social aspirations. She called me Christopher because she thought it was a nice name. She thought to shorten it to Chris, to circumcise it or amputate it, was a crime. And especially since my second name begins with H, and in England everything depends on the aspirate, and people who drop them are crude. The next thing that happens if you are called Chris and your name is Hitchens is Chris Hitchens. And that she would have thought would be unforgivably lower class.
Your upbringing was middle class, lower middle class, would you say? I don't know if those gradations...
Well, no one in England puts themselves in the lower middle class. They always want to say lower or maybe upper middle, or just middle. My father's family was quite working class. They came from a tough district in the Portsmouth dockyards where my grandfather rose to be a school teacher in a rather hard school. My father got out of it by moving into the Navy, going off to sea. He wouldn't have sounded like me at all. They wouldn't have spoken like this. And my mother's family came from a Jewish background in Liverpool. Again, by no means the forcing house of the British bourgeoisie. And both of them had sort of social aspirations, my mother particularly. And these were projected, is the word, I suppose, onto your humble servant, because I was the firstborn, and the proof that you've moved into the middle class proper in England is very simple. At least the firstborn son has to go to a private school, and then to a university. And which none of my family had done before. So I was always very acutely aware of the tiniest social nuances. George Orwell says about the English that they're all branded on the tongue from the moment they're born. It still is amazingly true.
So the accent.
The accent and the avoidance of certain commonplace expressions as well.
Interesting.
And above all, holding on to the H's.
So do you think that this weight of class on you was part of the reason why you felt liberated and became an American citizen? I guess this happened after 9/11, but nonetheless, do you think you were drawn in that direction?
Well, I can't explain completely why it was that in my teens I began to have this very strong need to come to the United States. But there it was. It was as strong as my need to become a writer. It wasn't a desire, it was a compulsion. In fact, I now realize they were probably two aspects of the same thing. But no question about it, yes, it was a means of getting out of a society that was rather too stratified, with oneself not stratified perhaps quite high up enough on the ladder. And
yet you managed to rise pretty high. I want to talk about your parents. First, your father. You already mentioned the fact that he came from a working class background, but he himself was in the British Navy. You refer to him affectionately and somewhat satirically as the commander. He seems to be a certain sort of British type that you admire and that I feel you feel is a lost breed.
And from a lost empire, too, which was dying, visibly dying while I was growing up. I was being educated in schools that admired and almost were still training you to work for an empire that when you opened the newspaper or turned on the TV, you could see was winding down. Weird feeling. And my father, who'd been all around the world on the deck of a Royal Navy warship, policing this empire, and then had a very tough time in the Second World War, very, very grueling Second World War, was let go by the Navy shortly after the war and felt that everything he'd worked for and everything he'd given his life to had proved not worthwhile, really, and that he wouldn't have put it like this, but I did. He'd been rather taken for granted and rather exploited by the establishment, the monarchy, the empire, to which he'd been so loyal. And that had a big influence in moving me to the left, because I thought, you do all this, you do everything right, you're brave, you're thrifty, you're flinty, you work, as they say here, work hard and play by the rules, and they don't treat you right.
Your mother then, and I feel there the emotion is very intense. Yvonne, a name that, as you note, is not an English name in itself, says something, was a glamorous character, an artistic character in certain respects, a dramatic character. She died in a suicide pact with her lover, who was a manic depressive, a former minister, and you, this was when you were already grown, you were an adult. This must have been devastating for you, and I wonder how it changed your view of the world or of people when this happened.
Well, the whole axis of the idea of my divided self, which is in a way the point of the book, is the huge contrast between her and my father. Among other things, he was 12 years older than her. And very stoic and continent, as I said, and a man of few words, very honest and decent, but frankly, boring. Or boring for her. She was bored by him, I could tell. And she would have liked a world of sort of brittle cocktail parties and gay visits to the theatre and so forth. And she never got that, you know, as a naval officer's wife, being moved around one grim base to another. And she tried in the millinery business, which was what her mother had been in also, to do something for the world of fashion, but it never worked out. She didn't have a very good business head, actually. So I grew up feeling in a different way sorry for both of them. And in those days, people of that class didn't get divorced. I used to wonder why they didn't, but I knew why. You just don't. It would be a scandal. And as a result, she waited too long. She waited till my brother and I had left home. When she finally broke it to me and introduced me to the guy who she desperately wanted me to approve of, I remember saying to myself, I can stand anything as long as she doesn't say, I waited till you and Peter were old enough. And then she did say exactly that. And I thought, what a waste. You know?
Well,
and she'd left it too late. And she was beginning to lose her looks, and she was very beautiful. I think felt it very acutely.
So she chose the wrong person.
And she chose, instead of a stoic but dull and honest and hardworking and reliable commander, Hitchens, she picked a spoiled priest of the Church of England, a guy who could quote the odd poem, who probably did like going to the theatre and cocktail parties, things like that.
Sounds Madame Bovary-ish.
Couldn't hold a job, was what we now would call a flake. And I now realize bipolar as well. And she didn't need to die or want to die, but she wanted someone who did need to die. And I believe he talked her into a pact of suicide when they realized it wasn't going to work out and they weren't going to get another chance with anyone else. So it was...
But you can never know the details behind it.
I can't know all of it, no, but I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I'm fairly sure that's what it was.
Well, you do mention that your mother, you found out after her death that she was Jewish.
Yes.
That was her background. And I think this is, it's interesting you say she was in no sense a Jewish mother, stereotypically, and yet the idea that she wanted to sacrifice, well, she hid her Judaism so that you and your brother could get on, strikes me as the epitome of the self-sacrificing Jewish mother taken to an extreme. Have you thought of that?
Yeah, self-sacrificing is one thing, but the classic martyred Jewish mother is not so self-effacing about her Jewishness, usually. I think my mother genuinely wanted to pass for her own sake. For one thing, she didn't, as they say, look Jewish. She looked French to me when I was a kid. My father never knew. See, his family would have minded.
Yes, you write that in the book.
I'm very sorry to say my grandfather would certainly not have wanted a Jewish daughter-in-law.
Well, may I ask you something?
Yes.
I interrupt you. Do you think growing up knowing you were Jewish would have changed you in some essential way?
Well, my only possible answer, thinkable answer to that is I can't believe it wouldn't have.
Because it would have been a major issue.
You know, so that boys like Mr. Kissin and Mr. Wertheimer wouldn't have seemed exotic to me. And I thought, actually, no, we're brothers under the skin. Funny thing is, I did an event with my friend Martin Amis at the Jewish Book Fair in London a couple of years ago. And I was doing a book signing afterwards, and I realized I should look up. There was something happening. And there were 3 or 4 of the young guys I'd been at Oxford with, all the Jews who'd been there, at a time when I hadn't known and they hadn't known. And we'd all found out since, and they knew that I knew, and so forth. And they'd all come, and there they were. And of course I looked at them in a completely different way. You know, we could have been cracking kind of odd jokes together and doing this and that.
Yeah, you would have had a different social scene, let's put it that
yes,
way.
I'm certain I would, yeah.
Okay.
But actually, if you join, as I did, the extreme Trotskyist Marxist left, you find that you practically are in a minyan.
You did your work at Oxford in literature? Was that your
No, I
area?
should have done.
Because you're steeped in literature and you refer to literary works throughout your book, and I'm struck by certain characters of books that you mention. Well, Orwell certainly, and Waugh. And it strikes me that you identify with Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited. Daniel Deronda is mentioned at one point. You studied that book with Edward Said, the Palestinian scholar.
Yes.
People who don't know Daniel Deronda is George Eliot's great book in which the character discovers he's an English aristocrat, or thinks he is. It discovers he's Jewish midway through. Fascinating, wonderful book.
Great book.
It strikes me also that there's sort of aspects of Johnsonian, Samuel Johnson friendship in your book. There's a sense of the Cambridge spies. There's a sense in which you've modeled yourself, or perhaps, I don't know whether it's unconsciously, used literary references to present yourself. Are you aware of this?
Yes.
Maybe even Pip in Great Expectations. There's a bit of that there as well.
Well, I hope it isn't. I hope it doesn't seem in any sense feigned, but yes, I mean, as soon as I realized that I thought there was no moral or ethical content to religion, which I've discovered quite early, I went looking for ethical discussions and confrontations about ideas and principles in literature, and to some extent in history. And Orwell was very important because he wrote his social novels, I'm talking about, not the anti-totalitarian ones or the essays, but his novels like Coming Up for Air, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Clergyman's Daughter. They're not very easy to find, but they're really worth digging out. And I didn't know novels were written about families like ours. I didn't think, you mean we can be literary too? It was like Molière's Monsieur Jourdain, who says, I didn't realize he's been speaking prose all his life. Even in War, well, who can't be moved by just the comic genius of that? And also the tragic element of it.
The character of Charles Ryder, there are interesting points of correspondence.
Well, no one who's been young and at Oxford doesn't have some point of view about Brideshead Revisited. And I call it Brideshead Regurgitated in the book, because there's always the terrible danger of an attempt to revive it, which would undoubtedly be hammy, but privately, everyone thinks, well, this person is the Sebastian Flyte of our time. I can actually remember who we used to think was the Sebastian Flyte character.
And were you assigned the
amazing
role?
Chap called and also the Anthony Blanche character. No, I wasn't. I was by then in a very austere leftist milieu where we would have thought that was unpardonably frivolous. We're not going to be doing Brideshead when Vietnam is burning from end to end.
Yet you were still having your dinners with James Sparrow.
Off the record. I was.
Yeah.
By night, I would don another garb, but no, we wouldn't have gone around giving punting parties with peaches and champagne and so forth.
It would have been a little too
yes,
self-indulgent.
we were supposed to be giving out leaflets in favor of Dr. King and against the Vietnam War and for the students in solidarity with the students in France and things like that.
But you were